Hey class, welcome back. We're going to talk now about the content of Luke's Gospel. There's a lot here to cover, a lot here to think about. We have the prologue to Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. This is where Luke tells us that he's writing this for Theophilus. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." This is the prologue. This is where Luke tells us who he's writing it to and why he's writing it. And he set out, he says, to create an orderly account. And he admits up front, he's been following this for a while. He's checked into it carefully. He's investigated it thoroughly. And he's giving us now an account of things. And he begins then with the infancy narrative. We have chapter 1, verse 5, all the way through chapter 2, verse 52. We have the birth narrative that involves not just Jesus, but John the Baptist as well. And this is where we really learn about the connection between Jesus and John the Baptist. We have, first of all, the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist, whose father was a member of the priesthood, whose mother was considered barren, and they were advanced in age and never had a child. An angel appears to him while he's in the temple burning incense on the altar of incense. A rare privilege. Not every person got chosen for this. The choosing was done by means of a special type of dice that the priests use, and he was chosen for this. And an angel appeared to him and told him that his wife Elizabeth was going to have a baby, and then struck him with dumbness so that he was mute because he didn't believe the angel's message. And so he was mute until John was born. And we get, within this whole context, we get the announcement of the birth of Jesus. The angel Gabriel appears to Mary, tells her that Elizabeth is already, I believe, 3 months pregnant, and that Mary is going to have the Son of the Most High, that he will be the son of his father David. So we have the birth announcement, and Mary goes to stay with Elizabeth till John is born. And when Mary walks in, we have this first meeting of Jesus and John the Baptist while they're both still in utero. And when Mary walks in, John the Baptist, in the womb of his mother, leaps, she says, for joy. And then we have the birth of John the Baptist, and they ask what to name the child. And Elizabeth says he's to be named John. And they say, well, there's nobody in either of your families with that name. Are you sure that's right? And Zacharias asks for something to write on and write with, and he writes the name John. And that's when he's suddenly able to speak again, and he's able to speak. We have also in this section of Luke, we have the Magnificat. We have Mary's psalm of praise. And when you look at it, it's almost as if King David has come back from the grave to write a psalm. Her psalm of praise to God is so beautiful, so magnificent, that it rivals anything David penned in the Psalms of the Old Testament. And so it's beautiful. And then we have the birth of Jesus. Now, there's a question about the birth of Jesus. We're told it's during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And we're told that it was during the registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And there have been questions about that because, based on what we know from Josephus, that date doesn't seem to jive with what Matthew tells us of the date of Jesus' birth during the reign of Herod. If dated in the reign of Herod, it's between 4 and 6 BC. And because Herod died in 4 BC. So how does this play out? Because according to Josephus, Quirinius was governor of Syria after Herod's death. Well, there's a new article came out in the last couple of years, 4 years now, in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, a journal by John Rhodes on Josephus's dating of the census of Quirinius. And what Dr. Rhodes argues, and he makes a good argument. I wouldn't say it's ironclad conclusive, but it's a strong argument that Josephus handles the dating of his material in his Jewish wars, which is primarily where this comes from, and in his other writings, he handles these dates more polemically than accurately. He plays with the dates in order to serve his purpose in producing a history of the Jewish people that is designed to sway the Roman officials one way or another with regard to certain things. And so Josephus's dates cannot be counted on as accurate, is his argument. And it's a good argument. I'm not sure it's an ironclad argument, but it is a very strong argument. It at least raises the real possibility that Josephus dates Quirinius incorrectly, and Luke probably has it right. And we know from other things in Luke's gospel and from things in the book of Acts, Luke is very careful as a historian to make sure he gets things right. Archaeology more and more has borne out the accuracy of Luke in terms of locations and names and dates of people being in different office capacities in the Roman government in different places. So I'm inclined to say that Luke is right, Josephus is wrong, especially with the argument that Dr. Rhodes has made in this article. In the notes, there's a reference to this article. You can go look it up. You can find it. You can read it for yourself and make your own determination. So, the birth of Jesus, this is the text where we have the angels, the shepherds. We have then Jesus being brought to the temple and presented in the temple when he's 8 days old for circumcision and for the sacrifice that Mary would be expected to bring for the birth of a male child. And we know that they were poor based on the sacrifice, because their sacrifice was the sacrifice of a couple living in poverty. So this tells us a great deal about Mary and Joseph. We also run into Anna and others in this whole setting. And we're told Mary pondered all these things in her heart. Here again, I think, is evidence. Luke has talked to Mary. Luke has interviewed Mary. He's met with Mary, and she's told him things that nobody else has written down. So I think this is very important. I think this is very key. And I think this gives a greater sense of authenticity to Luke's gospel in this regard. We have, in this same time frame, we have the gap of 12 years, and Jesus is brought to the temple as a boy, probably for what we would know today as the bar mitzvah, the rite of passage into manhood. And it's the time of an annual feast. And the family packs up with everybody else to leave, and Jesus gets left behind in the temple. And they're 3 days down the road before they realize Jesus isn't with some of the relatives, because they just assume everybody's, it's a large group traveled together. There's a lot of relatives. Jesus is somewhere in the group, and he's not. So they have to turn around and go back to Jerusalem. They find him in the temple, and his questions and his answers are confounding the religious leaders in the temple, even at this early age. And then we're told in the text that he went home with them, that he submitted to them, he was a good and an obedient son, and that he grew in stature, that is in height, and in favor with both God and men. Then we have the next section is the preparation for Jesus' public ministry. This begins in chapter 3. And it's interesting, Luke puts Jesus' genealogy in this part of the gospel, rather than at the beginning like Matthew did. And Luke's genealogy differs from Matthew's genealogy, and the argument generally is that one is the genealogy of Joseph, who is assumed to be Jesus' birth father, and the other is the genealogy of Mary, which is the actual biological line that goes all the way back. So we have two different genealogies, and they are different. One for Joseph, one for Mary, and that's generally how that's viewed. We have the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We're introduced to John the Baptist. We have the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, as we do in the other Gospels. And we have the 40 days in the wilderness. And then we have the beginning of controversy. No sooner does he come home to Nazareth, he reads this text that we read in the previous lecture. And people's initial response to him is very positive, but then they turn on him. Well, this is just Joseph and Mary's kid. Who's he think he is? You know, and they begin to turn on him. We have him teaching his disciples. And we have the question of who is Jesus? Who is this man? What makes him different? What makes him stand out? There's a lot of parables in Luke's gospel. And I would say when interpreting parables, I would favor Dr. Stein's approach. Assume that every parable has a singular meaning, one singular meaning. And look for the end stress on that parable. How does that parable end? Where does Jesus lay the emphasis at the end of that parable? That is your clue to the meaning. For instance, to leap way ahead to some of Jesus' other parables in Luke's gospel, it's oftentimes referred to as the parable of the prodigal son, but it's a parable of two brothers. And we're told straight up in the text that Jesus told this parable against the Pharisees. And the end stress is on the older brother who's angry because his repentant little brother has been accepted fully back into the family. And of course, the complaint was that Jesus hung out with the wrong kind of people, that he hung out with tax collectors, he hung out with sinners, he hung out with prostitutes, he hung out with the wrong kind of people. But Jesus said, I didn't come to call those who are well. I came to call the sick. I came to call sinners to repentance. And so we have this tension in Jesus' parables. Look at the end stress. We see Jesus' mastery over the world, the devil, and the flesh. We see his mastery over the world in the calming of the storm and the walking on the water. We see his mastery over the devil in casting out demons. And we see his mastery over the flesh in resisting temptation. We have Jesus and the 12 apostles. And this plays out in Luke's gospel. Luke's very careful about dealing with the 12 apostles. And then we have the journey to Jerusalem. And we have three different mentions of the journey to Jerusalem in Luke's gospel. So you want to pay close attention to that as you're working through the text. Then we have Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. All of this other has been up in Galilee, just like in Mark's gospel. Now we're into Jerusalem. And we're into his triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem. And Jesus comes in and he laments over the city and talks about how often he would have gathered her under his wings as a hen gathers her chicks. But she was not willing. And then he goes in and he cleanses the temple, just like we see in Mark's gospel. There's the cleansing of the temple in Luke's gospel as well. And then Jesus' authority is questioned by the Jewish leaders. By what authority do you do these things? So we have all of this. We have the question of tribute to Caesar raised as well. Again, just like in Mark, we have the questions about the resurrection of the dead and the Son of David, warnings regarding scribes, the widow and her 2 small coins, the prediction of the destruction of the temple, just like in Matthew and Mark. We have this same set of discussions of the destruction of the temple. We have end-time signs that are discussed in Luke's gospel, just like they are in Matthew and Mark. And the prediction of the coming of persecution, that those who follow Jesus will be persecuted. And in fact, There's an emphasis in all of the Gospels on persecution and how those who follow Jesus will be persecuted. So we ought not be surprised as believers when we're hated by the world, when we're called ugly things by the world, and when we're persecuted by the world. This is supposed to be situation normal for Christ followers. We have desolation predicted. We have the coming of the Son of Man predicted, the end time eschaton, the second coming of Christ. We have the parable of the fig tree, and an exhortation to be vigilant in our watching over things. Then we're given a window into the ministry in the temple and things that go on there before we come to Jesus and his passion in chapter 22, 23. We have here then the Last Supper. And again, the vocabulary of the Last Supper in Luke's Gospel, very, very close to the vocabulary and the wording, the sentences, everything to what we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which tells me that Luke and Paul, traveling together, were working from a common source for the Eucharistic tradition that they had. Then we have Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's in Luke's Gospel, again, the attention to medical detail, where we're told that Jesus sweated, as it were, great drops of blood. We have his arrest and his trial. And in Luke's Gospel, we have the Sanhedrin, we have Pilate, we have Herod. All of them are involved in this. And then we have the crucifixion. And Luke is very careful in detailing for us, from a medical standpoint, the crucifixion of Jesus and his death on the cross. Then in chapter 24, we have the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Luke chapter 24 is very important because, unlike Mark, where the women are at the empty tomb and they run away, in Luke's gospel there's more to it. We have the women at the empty tomb, yes. We have Jesus appears to two disciples as they're walking on the road to the small village of Emmaus. They turn around and head back to Jerusalem to tell the other disciples what's happened to them. They don't even recognize Jesus until they're in the house, and he blesses and breaks the bread for the dinner meal. And even as they're telling this, Jesus appears in the room to all the disciples. Now, the room's closed and locked, and Jesus appears. So what's their first response? They think it's a spirit, an apparition. It's not resurrection in the sense that Jesus intended to speak. And so what does Jesus tell them? He says, "Do you have any fish?" And they hand him some broiled fish, and he eats it in front of them. And he tells them, "A spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." The physical bodily resurrection of Jesus, Luke is careful to establish as a reality, because in the gospel, the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus is essential to the gospel. If we deny that, if we let go of that, if we give up that, there's nothing left. And Paul makes this very clear in his preaching and teaching later. We'll come to that when we deal with Paul, especially in Romans and 1 Corinthians. But Luke is very careful to establish that this Jesus, who has appeared to them out of nowhere in a closed room, has corporeal capacity. He has flesh and bones, and yet, somehow, because of his glorified state as the resurrected Christ, he is able to pass through solid objects, to appear and disappear. And so there's something different, qualitatively different, about the resurrected state than what there is in the state in which Jesus lived before and in which we live now. And in this context, Jesus gives the commission to the disciples to go and preach the gospel to all nations, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be preached in all nations. And so we have this emphasis again on repentance and on the forgiveness of sins. And then we have the ascension. And the way Luke wraps up the gospel is designed to lead us into the book of Acts, which picks up with the ascension and the commission, and another set of words and worded a little differently. And so that is a quick thumbnail sketch of the Gospel of Luke. And of course, you're not reading the entire Gospel of Luke, at least not assigned to read the entire Gospel of Luke. You're primarily going to be focusing on those areas where Luke diverges from Mark and or Matthew. And so Mark is the one you're going to read in full. John you will also read in full. Luke and Matthew you will read in portions. And so this is a thumbnail sketch of the Gospel of Luke. And it's a fascinating book. It's a powerful book. It's an especially useful book if you're preaching or teaching or dealing with issues related to the poor, the outcast of society, these kinds of issues. It's a critical book for the life of the church today in regard to these special issues.